December 7th, 1941. American generals thought they were untouchable. Then Japan struck Pearl Harbor. What they saw that morning changed everything. 8 battleships destroyed in under 2 hours, and a military strategy no one predicted. But here's what historians rarely tell you. The generals' first reactions weren't about the attack itself. It was about something far more terrifying they discovered in the wreckage. Something that revealed Japan's true capabilities. And when they finally understood it, their words were chilling. The calm before chaos. Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor was peaceful. American battleships sat quietly in the water like sleeping giants. Sailors were drinking coffee. Officers were reading newspapers. Some men were still asleep in their bunks. Nobody expected what was coming. The United States Navy was the most powerful force in the Pacific, or so everyone believed. American generals had one simple view of Japan. They were a smaller nation with outdated equipment. Intelligence reports said Japan wouldn't dare attack American soil. It would be foolish. It would be impossible. But at exactly 7:48 a.m., that belief shattered. The first wave arrived without warning. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky, and within seconds, American generals realized something terrifying. They had completely underestimated their enemy. What happened next would change the course of history. But the attack itself? That was only the beginning of what shocked them most. The first explosions. The explosions started before anyone understood what was happening. Torpedoes slammed into battleships. Bombs dropped from the sky like rain. Admiral Husband Kimmel was the commander of the Pacific Fleet. He stood at his window watching his ships burn. One officer later said Kimmel's face went completely white. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then he said just 3 words, "This can't be." But it was real. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that men a mile away felt the ground shake. Over 1,000 sailors were trapped inside. General Walter Short commanded the Army forces in Hawaii. When the attack started, he was eating breakfast. Someone ran in shouting about Japanese planes. Short didn't believe it at first. He thought it was a training drill gone wrong. Then he stepped outside and saw the chaos. Flames, smoke, screaming men running in every direction. And he realized America was under attack. But what truly shocked these generals wasn't just the destruction. It was how Japan pulled it off. The impossible distance. American military leaders had one major assumption about Japan. They believed Japan couldn't reach Hawaii. It was too far. The ocean was too big. Pearl Harbor was over 3,700 miles from Japan. No carrier fleet had ever traveled that distance undetected. It seemed impossible. But Japan did it anyway. 6 aircraft carriers crossed the Pacific in complete silence. They avoided all patrol routes. They stayed hidden in storms. When American generals learned how far the Japanese fleet had traveled, they were stunned. One officer said it was like a ghost army appearing out of nowhere. Admiral Kimmel asked his intelligence team a simple question. How did we miss this? Nobody had an answer. The planning was flawless. Japan had studied American routines for months. They knew when patrols changed. They knew when defenses were weakest. And they struck at the perfect moment. But here's what made it even more shocking. The technology they used. American generals had no idea Japan had advanced this far. And when they saw the evidence, it changed everything. The torpedo that shouldn't exist. Pearl Harbor's water was shallow. only 40 feet deep in most areas. American military experts believed this made the base safe from torpedo attacks. Standard torpedoes would hit the bottom and explode harmlessly in the mud. It was basic physics. Everyone agreed. But Japan had a secret. They modified their torpedoes with wooden fins. This allowed them to run in shallow water without diving too deep. When American engineers examined the wreckage, they couldn't believe what they found. One general said, "They solved a problem we thought was unsolvable." These torpedoes were devastatingly effective. They punched through ship hulls like paper. Battleships that were supposed to be untouchable sank in minutes. The USS Oklahoma capsized so fast that over 400 men were trapped inside. The USS West Virginia took multiple hits and settled into the harbor floor. Admiral Kimmel held one of the recovered torpedo fins in his hands. He stared at it in silence. Then he said something chilling. "We trained for the wrong war." But the torpedoes were just one surprise. The bombers carried something even more dangerous. Armor-piercing bombs. Japanese bombers flew over the harbor in perfect formation. They weren't dropping regular explosives. These were armor-piercing bombs, designed specifically to destroy battleships. American ships had thick steel decks. They were built to withstand punishment. But Japan had modified naval artillery shells into aerial bombs. When these bombs hit, they punched straight through the armor. They exploded deep inside the ships, where the damage was catastrophic. The USS Arizona was hit by one of these bombs. It penetrated the deck and detonated in the ammunition storage. The entire ship exploded in seconds. Over 1,000 men were lost instantly. The explosion was so powerful that pieces of the ship were found hundreds of feet away. General Short later said, "We didn't know they had weapons like this." American intelligence had completely missed Japan's technological developments. But it wasn't just the weapons. It was the pilots flying them. And what American generals learned about these pilots was perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. The elite pilots. American military leaders had always believed their pilots were the best in the world. But the Japanese pilots at Pearl Harbor were on another level. These weren't ordinary flyers. They were veterans with thousands of hours of experience. Many had fought in China. They'd been training for years. Their accuracy was terrifying. Bombs hit targets with precision. Torpedoes struck exactly where they needed to. One American officer watched the attack from the ground. He later wrote, "They flew like they'd practiced this route 100 times." And they had. Japan built a complete replica of Pearl Harbor for training. Pilots practiced the attack over and over until it was perfect. General Short spoke with several captured Japanese aviators after the war. He asked them how long they'd trained. One pilot said, "Every day for 6 months." Short was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We never saw this coming." But the skill of the pilots was only part of the equation. The real question was, how did Japan coordinate such a massive operation without anyone knowing? The intelligence failure. American intelligence had warning signs, but nobody connected the pieces. In the weeks before the attack, Japan recalled many of its diplomats from Washington. Japanese merchant ships started leaving American ports. Radio traffic from Japan's Navy suddenly went silent. These were red flags, but American analysts thought Japan was preparing to attack somewhere in Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel received a warning message from Washington on November 27th.
It said, "Be prepared for possible aggressive action by Japan." But it didn't mention Pearl Harbor specifically. Kimmel increased patrols slightly, but he didn't put the base on full alert. He didn't think Japan would strike American territory. After the attack, Kimmel was devastated. He said, "I should have seen it coming." General Short felt the same way. Both men were later removed from command. They carried the weight of that morning for the rest of their lives. But here's what many people don't know. Even after the attack started, some American forces fought back. And what they managed to do surprised even the Japanese. The American response. Not everyone was caught completely off guard. Some American servicemen reacted immediately. Two young pilots, George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, were at a party the night before. They heard the explosions and ran to their planes. Without orders, they took off and engaged the Japanese attackers. Welch eliminated 4 enemy aircraft. Taylor took down 2. Their courage inspired others. Anti-aircraft crews scrambled to their guns. Sailors grabbed rifles and fired at low-flying planes. The USS Nevada tried to escape the harbor. Even while under heavy fire, the crew attempted to reach open water. Japanese bombers swarmed the ship, but it kept moving. One Japanese pilot later said he was impressed by the Nevada's crew. He called them incredibly brave. But the damage was done. By the time the attack ended, 8 battleships were destroyed or heavily damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were eliminated. Over 2,000 Americans lost their lives. When the Japanese planes finally left, an eerie silence fell over the harbor. And American generals were left with one haunting realization: the aftermath silence. The fires burned for days. Black smoke covered the sky. Admiral Kimmel walked through the destruction. He saw men pulling bodies from the water. He saw ships that would never sail again. One officer approached him and said, "Sir, what do we do now?" Kimmel didn't answer right away. He just stared at the wreckage. Finally, he said, "We rebuild, and we make sure this never happens again." General Short toured the army bases. Planes were destroyed on the ground. Buildings were riddled with bullet holes. He gathered his remaining officers. His message was simple: "We underestimated them. We won't make that mistake twice." But the psychological impact was enormous. America had always felt safe. 2 oceans protected the country from foreign threats. That sense of security vanished in 2 hours. And American military leaders knew they had to change everything: their strategy, their technology, their thinking. But there was one more discovery that shook them to their core. Something found in the wreckage that revealed Japan's long-term planning.
The secret maps. When American forces examined Japanese aircraft, they found something disturbing: detailed maps of Pearl Harbor. These weren't rough sketches, they were precise, professional drawings. Every building was marked. Every ship's usual position was noted. Japanese intelligence had been watching Pearl Harbor for months, possibly years. They knew the layout better than some American officers. One map showed where fuel storage tanks were located. Another showed the exact depths of the harbor at different points. General Short held one of these maps. He said, "They knew everything about us." American counterintelligence had failed completely. Japanese spies had operated freely in Hawaii. They'd taken photographs, they'd counted ships, they'd timed patrol schedules. It was a massive security breakdown, and it showed just how seriously Japan had prepared for this moment. But here's what truly haunted American generals. If Japan could plan this attack so perfectly, What else were they capable of? The answer would become clear in the months ahead. Japan's wider strategy. Pearl Harbor wasn't Japan's only target that day. While American generals dealt with the chaos in Hawaii, reports came in from across the Pacific. Japan attacked the Philippines. They struck British forces in Malaya. They invaded Thailand. They assaulted Wake Island and Guam. It was a coordinated assault across thousands of miles, all happening at nearly the same time. American military leaders realized this wasn't just about Pearl Harbor. Japan was executing a massive expansion strategy. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor days after the attack. He'd been chosen to take over the Pacific Fleet. When he saw the destruction, someone asked if he thought America could win. Nimitz looked at the sunken ships. Then he said something remarkable. The Japanese made 3 mistakes. Everyone went quiet. What mistakes? Nimitz explained, they didn't destroy our repair facilities. They didn't hit our fuel storage. And most importantly, our aircraft carriers weren't here. Those 3 factors would change everything. But American generals didn't know that yet. At that moment, they only saw defeat. The carriers that escaped. By pure chance, America's aircraft carriers weren't at Pearl Harbor that morning. The USS Enterprise was returning from a mission. The USS Lexington was delivering planes to Midway Island. The USS Saratoga was in California for maintenance. If those carriers had been in the harbor, they would have been destroyed. Japan would have controlled the Pacific completely. But they survived, and they became the foundation of America's comeback. Admiral Kimmel understood this immediately. Despite everything that went wrong, he knew those carriers gave America a chance. When Admiral Nimitz took command, he focused everything on carrier warfare. The age of battleships was over. Carriers were now the most important weapons in naval combat. Japan had proven that at Pearl Harbor. They'd used carrier-based aircraft to devastate a fleet. Now America would do the same. But it would take time. Months of rebuilding, training, planning. And American generals knew they were in a race against time. Because Japan wasn't stopping. They were advancing across the Pacific, and they seemed unstoppable. The emotional toll. The personal cost of Pearl Harbor weighed heavily on American commanders. Admiral Kimmel never recovered from the attack. He felt responsible for every life lost. He wore the burden for the rest of his days. His family fought for decades to clear his name. General Short faced similar pain. Both men were accused of negligence. Congressional hearings investigated their actions, but many historians now believe they were scapegoats. The real failure was at the highest levels of government and intelligence. Still, Kimmel and Short never stopped blaming themselves. One officer who knew Kimmel said, "He died with Pearl Harbor on his mind." But from tragedy came transformation. American military leadership changed completely. New doctrines were written. New technologies were developed. The generals who survived Pearl Harbor learned painful lessons, and they passed those lessons to the next generation of commanders. Men like Nimitz, Halsey, and MacArthur. These leaders would take the fight back to Japan, and they would never forget what happened that December morning. The words that defined a generation. When President Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, he spoke the words that defined the moment. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. But American generals had their own words, words spoken in the immediate aftermath, words that revealed their shock, their pain, and their determination. Admiral Nimitz said, "We'll learn from this, and we'll make them regret it." General Douglas MacArthur, whose forces in the Philippines were also attacked, said, "I shall return." Admiral Halsey, when he heard about the attack, said, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will only be spoken in hell."
These weren't just tough words, they were promises.
American generals understood they'd been beaten, but they also understood something Japan didn't fully realize. They'd awakened a sleeping giant. The United States had the resources, the manpower, and now the motivation. Pearl Harbor united the country like nothing else could, and American military leaders channeled that unity into victory. But it would take 4 long years. The final lesson. So what did American generals truly say when they saw Japan's true military strength in the Pacific theater? They said, "We were wrong." They said we underestimated them completely. They said this changes everything. But more than their words, it was what they did next that mattered. They rebuilt the Pacific Fleet. They developed new strategies centered on carrier warfare. They trained a new generation of pilots. The Battle of Midway, just 6 months later, proved they'd learned. American forces defeated Japan's carrier fleet in one of history's most important naval battles. Pearl Harbor taught American generals a lesson they never forgot. Never underestimate your enemy. Never assume you're safe. Never stop preparing. Those lessons shaped American military doctrine for generations. They're still taught today. Pearl Harbor was a devastating defeat, but it transformed American military thinking. And in a strange way, Japan's greatest victory planted the seeds of their ultimate defeat. The generals who survived that morning made sure of it. This is how American commanders first understood Japan's true military strength in the Pacific theater. Their reactions shaped everything that followed. The assessment of Japan's capabilities changed World War II completely. What began as shock became determination. If you found this perspective on military leadership during the Pacific War insightful, subscribe for more untold stories. History's greatest lessons come from moments like these. Thanks for watching.